Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuhu. I am Muammar Kiyani Ulangkaya. We will discuss this topic titled Fundamental Concept of Ethics. Let's start. Morality refers to that quality of goodness or badness in a human act. Also, morality is a good thing and immorality is a bad thing. So, ang tinatawag kung ikaw ay gumagawa ng masama is immorality. Morality, a person should always do good things and never do bad things. Ang morality daw is ito yung taong gumagawa ng mabubuti at hindi gumagawa ng masama. Morality is not an imagined quality merely supposed to be found in human acts. Ang morality is hindi siya pondo ng human acts. Norm of morality. Right and wrong, good or bad, high and low, just and unjust, presuppose a basis or a standard criticism test rule, principle, or law by which distinguish from other. Ang norm of morality, dito natin makikita kung ano yung behavior ng isang tao. Kung ito ba siya ay mabuti or ito ba siya ay masama. By norm morality, we mean, therefore, number 1, the standard of right and wrong in human acts. Ito natin makikita yung standard kung ano ang tama at mali ng human acts. 2, the reason why certain acts are normally right and why certain actions are wrong. Ito yung dahilan kung bakit ang ilang mga kilos ay normal na tama at kung bakit ang ilang mga kilos ay mali. So, dito na nakikita sa norm of morality. Human acts. Ethics deals with the study of man and particularly with his actions. But not everyday act which proceeds from man is a human act, used and understood in ethics. So these are examples of human acts nasa picture. Like yung pulubi, tinulungan nung lalaki nung naka-red nung pulubi kahit walang kapalit. Sa baba naman niya is yung mga nagko-compete. Like dyan is hinang-hina na yung babae at tinulungan ng isang babae rin. So, by human acts in ethics, we mean, number 1, the free voluntary acts of man. So, nagpapakita dito yung free voluntary acts of man. Parang halimbawa dyan yung lalaki, yung naka-red. Yung free voluntary, so, kusa niyang ginawa sa pulubi na tulungan. Acts done with knowledge and consent. And number 3, acts which are proper to man as a man because of all animals he alone has knowledge and freedom of will. Number 4, acts which we are conscious or under control and for which we are responsible. So, sinasabi din dito, ang human acts, responsibilidad din natin yung mga ginagawa natin. And 5, human acts are those of which man is master, which he has the power of doing or not doing as he pleases. So, kusang ginagawa ng tao na tulungan yung kapwa niya. Voluntariness and responsibility. The fundamental concepts of ethics, morality, human acts, Responsibility, reward, or punishment are intimately related to each other. All these concepts presuppose freedom of choice in man or voluntariness. So, ang voluntariness and responsibility, ito yung nag-volunteer ka at responsibilidad mo rin na gawin iyon. 1. Relation between voluntariness and ethics. Ethics studies human acts, and human acts to be human must be voluntary. Second, between morality and voluntariness. Only voluntary acts have a moral bearing. It is absurd and silly to speak of a morality of dogs, stones, horses, etc. Precisely because these do not have the freedom of choice in their actions. 3. Human act and voluntariness. We have shown that human acts are the free acts of man. 4. Responsibility and voluntariness. There can be responsibility only if there is knowledge, and consent means voluntariness. 5. Punishment. It is absurd and most cruel to punish anyone who acted because of pure necessary for doing what he could not do otherwise, unless there is voluntariness. There can be responsibility, and without responsibility, punishment is meaningless. So, sa 5, ito yung kung responsibilidad mo na linisin yung kapaligiran mo at hindi mo nilinis, may punishment yun.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Good day to all of you. My name is Abdullah Bir Anayatin. So, I'm the second reporter for the fundamental concept of ethics. The moral principle involved in two actions having two effects. A difficult question sometimes arises as to whether it would be morally right to do a certain action from which good as well as bad effect follow. For example, should a man be restrained from saving his honor because the reputation of a high government official will be destroyed from disclosure he has to make in his defense? Or what was it morally right to drop the atomic bomb, which would shorten the war, but which would destroy thousands and thousands of innocent lives? Or is it morally right to do an act which entails bad as well as good consequences? The answer of these questions is yes, but under the certain condition or the following. These are the following conditions. A. The act in itself should be good or at least morally indifferent. So, the act must be in a good intention or good purposes. The second is the evil effect should not be directly intended but morally allowed to happen as a regrettable side issue. And the third is, there should be a reason sufficiently grave in doing the act. So basically, lahat naman ng action natin is meron talagang reason behind it. And the fourth is that the evil effect should not outweigh and the good effects. So, dapat mas matimbang pa rin yung or mas prior pa rin yung good effect rather than the evil effect. Factors that lessen accountability. Since responsibility depends on the voluntariness present in an act, we must inquire into the factor and which affect voluntariness in an action. These are namely ignorance, concupiscence, fear, and violence. Ignorance is the absence of intellectual knowledge. We distinguish between vincible and invincible ignorance. Vincible ignorance can be dispelled or overcome by due amount of diligence. Invincible ignorance cannot be overcome by any amount of diligence or effort because under the circumstances it is impossible for one to know So, yung pagkakaiba lang dito is, yung invincible ignorance is yung mga bagay na imposible nating malaman. So, di tayo magte-take responsible from that. Tapos, yung invincible ignorance naman is may possibility na alam natin or dapat na alam pero will acknowledge about it. So, means ay magte-take responsible tayo doon. So, principles. Invincible ignorance excuses and relieves the agent of responsibility. Act done in individual ignorance are therefore voluntary and the agent is not held responsible for them. For example, this is the perfect example for it. A Negrito who had been living all his life in the mountain and who happened to come to Manila for the first time and violated traffic laws could not be held responsible for violating the law. So, yung sa sinabi ko kanina, yung wala talagang chance na malaman yung bagay which is yung invincible ignorance. Tulad dito kay sa Negrito na napunta sa Manila na hindi naman siya sanay sa pamumuhay dun. So, may na-violate siyang law which is yung traffic law. So, hindi siya magte-take responsible sa kanyang na-violate na law. Invincible ignorance does not destroy or remove voluntariness nor responsibility. Act done invincible ignorance are still voluntary and the agent is still responsible for them. Example, a Manila resident who violated traffic law not knowing of such law before would still be responsible for his act because his ignorance is invincible. So, since na dito naman sa Manila resident na ito ay magte-take responsible siya sa kanyang na-violate na law kasi sanay naman siya sa pamumuhay unlike sa Negrito na namuhay siya sa mountain. Concupiscence. These are passion. Technically called concupiscence affect the voluntariness of an action. For a man acting under the influence of a passion would not be acting perfectly of his own free volition. A man in a fit of anger, for instance, is liable to do act which otherwise he would not do in his right senses. We distinguish between antecedent and consequent concupiscence. The former is the type of consequences which occur in us spontaneously without our stimulating it. The latter one arises at the command or continue with the consequent consent of the will. The first impulse is not free and consequently not imputable to us in as far as concupiscence impels the will. It restrains our liberty and thus lessen our responsibility. So the principle dito is yung antecedent concupiscence. Lessen but does not remove voluntariness and responsibility. Consequent concupiscence neither lessen or destroy responsibilities.
Fear and violence. Moral principles. First, when we act because of fear, our will is dragged along so to stay, and so its freedom is restricted and our responsibility is diminished correspondingly. Great fear sometimes exempts a person from acts enjoyed by positive law or law of state. Second, is an impulse from without tending to force the agent to act against his will. The principle of coercion. Active and passive principle of violence closely connected with the moral principle of the twofold effect is the moral principle involving coercion, which may be stated briefly in this form. Under certain conditions, it is morally right to use force or employ violence in defense of certain basic rights. Even if by the employment of such force or violence certain evil effects may follow, such as the death or the aggressor. This moral principle is justified on the following grounds. At first, Man as a person possesses certain fundamentals right, or chapter 9. The existence of a right of one entails is corresponding duty on others to respect this right. Third, that if these rights are violated or denied, the possessor thereof has the right to defend and use the means necessary to defend his right. And last, sometimes the employment of force or violence resulting in the bloodshed of death or an aggressor is the only possible way to defend his right. At fifth, the evil effects that often follow or accompany the use of force and merely concomitant and resultant factors and it not directly intended are extrinsic to the nature of the means or act used and therefore does not contradict our principle that one should not employ intrinsically evil means even to attain in a good end. The use of force or violence independent of the end or the effects it produces is not bad in itself. Number 6. These are two effects involved here, one good and one bad. Defense of the right of the possessor, which is good, and harm on the aggressor, which is bad. And hence to do an act which brings about these two effects may be justified under the conditions provided in the principle of the twofold effect. This is likewise is a consonance with the moral sound principle that if one had to choose between two evils, one should choose the lesser. Herein the evil effects of defensive acts are less than the evil effects of offense. Offense justify defense as long as no great harm be inflicted than what is necessary for defense, according to the moral established principle of the twofold effect. Violence and habit. The principle of a passive violence can be stated briefly and is self-explanatory. Acts done owing to violence. Example, acts one does because one is forced against his will to do, are not voluntary provided that resistance is made. Consequently, the door is not morally responsible for doing such acts. The moral principle governing acts done by force of habit reads, acts done by force of habit are still voluntary at least in cause, as long as the habit is allowed to stay. The explanation of the two principles. When we are forced to do things or act entirely against our will, then obviously our acts are not voluntary and hence we are not responsible. Therefore, provided due resistance is made. The resistance should be present throughout the whole act. Lack a will or effort to offer adequate resistance and disapproval may render the act voluntary all by it minimally. Where acts done by force or of habit, there is still voluntariness of the part of the door, and he is responsible for the same if he would fully develop the habit and makes no effort to overcome. The same whatever therefore one laws or follows from the habit which they initially entertained and allowed to become a part of an is still voluntary of the part of the door, part of him.